I was humiliated at my own brother's wedding. My parents called me the gardener, like it was a dirty word. They didn't even try to hide it. I wasn't seated with family. I wasn't even near the back. I was shoved to a corner table by the kitchen like some hired help they wanted out of sight, people whispered. My brother's new in-laws stared. Not one person from my family looked me in the eye. They didn't know who I had become. But the moment that mic was lifted, everything changed. You want to know what happened when the mayor stood up and said my name? You want to see how the black sheep, the outcast, the nobody ended up becoming the one person the entire room clapped for? This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about breaking free from toxic family, becoming more than what they ever expected, and making them watch as the one they dismissed stood in the spotlight. And trust me, you'll want to see their faces when it happens. Stay with me. The ending is worth it. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 42 years old, a professional landscape designer, and the owner of a small but growing design firm based just outside Portland. But long before any of that, I was simply the quiet daughter in a loud family, the one who never quite fit the mold. Growing up in a household where garlic and tomato sauce were the family's heartbeat, I often felt like an outsider even at my own dinner table. That table was more than a place to eat. It was where the family empire was discussed, where decisions were made, and where futures were forged, just not mine. Our family restaurant had been in operation for over 30 years. My father, Frank Carter, was a commanding presence, the kind of man whose voice could cut through a crowded dining room without ever needing to raise it. My mother, Diane, was his quieter counterpart, but no less intense. She was always keeping things moving, making sure every fork was polished and every staff member stayed in line. And then there was my older brother, Jason, the golden boy. From the time he could hold a spatula, it was clear he was destined to inherit everything. He was confident, charming in a forced kind of way, and always eager to please our parents. I was never expected to lead. I wasn't even expected to participate. That became painfully clear one evening during what I now think of as the dinner that decided everything. It was a Sunday night, like so many others. The smell of roasted garlic and slow-cooked meat filled the house, the same way it always did on weekends. We were gathered around the long oak dining table, my father at the head, carving the roast with his usual precision, Jason seated to his right, already halfway into a glass of Chianti. My mother passed the bread around with her usual quiet efficiency, and I sat across from Jason, mostly ignored, quietly picking at my food. The conversation that night centered entirely around Jason and the future of the restaurant. My father's voice was booming with pride. Jason, I've been thinking. Next quarter, we expand the wine list. You'll handle that, right? You've got a good nose. Jason, ever the eager heir, nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely, Dad. I already have a few Italian imports in mind. I listened, chewing slowly, trying to make myself as small as possible. No one asked for my opinion. No one even looked at me. And that was nothing new. I had grown used to being background noise in my own family. Then, in a rare moment of inclusion, my mother turned to me and asked, Helen, you've always liked that little herb garden, haven't you? What was that thing you planted last spring? Her voice was light, almost teasing. Lavender, I said, surprised she remembered. Jason laughed through a mouthful of meat. Of course it was. She's our little gardener. Probably out there talking to the plants. He winked at my parents like it was the funniest thing in the world. My father chuckled but didn't miss his chance to twist the knife. You know, Helen, gardening is fine for a hobby. But you're not getting any younger. It's time you started thinking about something real. Something real. Those words stuck in my chest like a thorn. I had always known my father didn't respect what I loved, but hearing it phrased so bluntly hurt more than I expected. I put my fork down, my appetite gone. I just like being outside, I said quietly, working with plants, creating something peaceful. My mother exchanged a quick look with my father, a familiar one, the kind that said, "There she goes again." She didn't reply, just sipped her wine. My father scoffed. "You can't make a living playing in the dirt, Helen. You need a proper job. You're part of this family. The restaurant is our legacy." Jason leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Maybe she can grow the basil for the kitchen. That way she can still be useful." He said it like a joke, but the smugness in his voice made it clear he meant every word. I stared at my plate, my hands clenched in my lap. I could feel the heat rising in my face. This wasn't just teasing. This was dismissal. I wasn't seen as someone with dreams or value. I was a footnote in a family story, already written without me. In that moment, I realized something important. My family would never see me for who I was. No matter how hard I tried to explain what the soil meant to me, what plants meant, they'd always see me as the girl wasting her time in the garden, a hobbyist, an afterthought. I didn't argue that night. I didn't cry or shout. I just went to bed quietly, the words, "something real," echoing in my mind. But I knew something had shifted inside me. That dinner didn't just show me where I stood, it made it clear I needed to step away. It would take me years to build the courage to walk away fully. But looking back now, that dinner was the beginning. The moment I realized I'd never bloom, if I stayed rooted in a garden, they refused to water. Most people don't remember their earliest moments of joy. For me, it's crystal clear bare feet on damp earth, the smell of wet pine needles in the air, and my small hand clutching the larger, weathered hand of my grandmother, Ruth. I was 9 years old the summer the storm hit. A brutal windstorm had swept through our town, pulling down branches, flooding basements, and in my grandmother's case, flattening her beloved backyard garden. I remember running up the little stone path to her house the morning after, expecting to find her devastated. Instead, I found her kneeling calmly among the debris, a shovel in one hand, and her straw hat tilted against the morning sun. She turned to me, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes bright. "Well," she said, as if commenting on spilled flour, "I guess the garden decided it wanted a fresh start." I blinked, confused. "Aren't you sad?" She smiled. "Plants don't give up, honey. They bend, they break, but if the root survives, they grow back stronger. You'd be surprised what a flower can teach you about life." We spent the next 3 days rebuilding that garden. I was too small to be of any real use, but Grandma Ruth made me feel important. She let me choose which flowers went where, showed me how to turn soil properly, and let me hold the hose like it was a magic wand. She talked while we worked about seasons and soil, about patience, and about how every plant has its own rhythm. She told stories of when she was young, how her mother had taught her to plant daisies in coffee tins and watch them sprout by the windowsill. But mostly, she listened. For the first time, I felt heard. That garden, once rebuilt, became our place. Every weekend, I would ride my bike out to her cottage and spend hours pulling weeds, watering, or just sitting beside her, watching things grow. We planted lavender in the far left corner because she said it kept the mosquitoes away, and roses near the gate so it would smell like kindness when guests arrived. But my favorite was the row of violets we planted along the stone wall. One of them smaller than the rest, a deep, royal purple, was mine. I named it Bonnie. I checked on it every week, whispered to it like a secret. When it finally bloomed, I plucked one of its flowers and pressed it into a book Grandma gave me, just an old gardening journal with blank pages. She said it was for whatever I wanted to grow inside. I still have that book. I still have that flower. It's brittle now, paper thin and faded at the edges, but it's followed me through every move, every heartbreak, every moment I wanted to give up. Back then, I didn't know what landscape design was. I just knew I loved watching beauty come from dirt. Where others saw mess, I saw potential. Where others saw weeds, I saw wildflowers waiting to be understood. That garden taught me more than school ever did. It taught me that growth takes time, that storms are just pauses in the cycle, and that healing can be quiet. It didn't ask me to perform, to impress, or to compete. It simply welcomed me. It was a far cry from the clatter and sharpness of my parents' world, the clanging pans, the hurried orders, the endless push for perfection inside the restaurant. My father respected control. My mother respected presentation. But Grandma Ruth? She respected patience, softness, and resilience. She saw value in what took time. It was under her wing that I started sketching garden layouts on napkins, dreaming about parks, healing spaces, places where people could breathe. I would cut out pictures from magazines of fountains and ivy-covered benches, not knowing that those scraps would become the foundation for my future. I didn't have the words for it back then. I couldn't articulate why working with soil felt holy, or why I preferred silence to applause. But I knew that when I was with her, in that space, I belonged. So while my brother learned how to flambe and pair wines, I learned how to wait for sprouts. He memorized customer preferences. I memorized bloom cycles. He inherited the family name in neon lights above the restaurant. I inherited the hush of violets blooming after a storm. And in that contrast, the distance between our lives began. Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in quiet conviction. My roots had already started growing elsewhere. They just didn't see it yet. I wouldn't fully realize it until much later, but those days in Grandma Ruth's garden were the first steps toward everything I would become. A girl with dirt under her fingernails, a pressed violet in her journal, and a dream of building beauty from the broken. It was the first bloom of a life they never planned for, but one I would learn to cultivate on my own. By the time senior year rolled around, the difference between me and my family had stretched into something unmistakable. Jason was already working part-time at the restaurant, his sleeves rolled up, shouting orders like he was born to command. My father praised him like a soldier returning from battle. Every weekend was filled with discussions about menu expansions, staffing challenges, liquor licenses, and marketing strategies. Even my mother, who usually kept to herself, seemed energized by the future that awaited my brother. They talked about the Carter legacy, like it was already set in stone, and all that remained was for Jason to step in and take his rightful place. I sat through those conversations quietly, nodding when necessary, smiling politely while they talked around me. But inside, something had shifted. The garden, the sketches, the pressed flower in my journal, they weren't just hobbies anymore. They were calling me in a way I couldn't ignore. The tension finally broke the week of graduation. We were sitting in the family room after dinner. Jason was stretched across the couch, tossing peanuts in the air and catching them with his mouth. My father stood behind his armchair, a glass of bourbon in one hand, and my mother was flipping through a college admissions brochure from a state business school nearby. "So," Frank said without looking at me, "we've been talking, and we think it's time you got serious about college. You'll enroll in the business program at Mid-State in the fall. It's close, it's affordable, and you can work part-time at the restaurant." He said it like the decision had already been made. My stomach tightened. I had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in my head, but now that it was real, my voice felt trapped somewhere behind my ribs. I looked at my mother. She didn't meet my gaze. Jason smirked like he was waiting for me to say something stupid. "I'm not going to Mid-State," I said quietly. My father lowered his glass. "Come again?" "I'm not going to business school," I repeated, firmer now. "I've been accepted to the landscape design program at Evergreen College. It's not local, but they offered me a partial scholarship." The room went still, like I had just dropped a curse word into a prayer. My father set his glass down with a thud. "Landscape design?" he said, drawing the words out like they tasted sour. "Are you joking?" "No, I'm not," I said. "It's what I want. I've already accepted the offer." "You've already accepted?" My mother finally spoke, her voice more stunned than angry. "Without talking to us?" "I knew what the answer would be," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I can't keep pretending I want what you want. I'm not Jason. I don't want to run the restaurant." Jason gave a low whistle and shook his head. "Well, looks like the gardener's gone full flower child. What are you going to do, Helen? Design fancy lawns for rich people?" "It's a real profession," I snapped, the words coming out sharper than I meant. "And I'm good at it." My father's face darkened. "You think we're made of money? You think we're going to waste a dime on you playing in the dirt while your brother carries this family?" "I didn't ask for your money," I said, standing now. "I've got a scholarship and I'll work part-time. I'll figure it out." He stepped toward me, voice rising. "Then you're on your own. Don't expect a cent. Don't come crawling back when it falls apart." That I held my ground. "I won't." Behind them, Aunt Carol sat silently in the corner, knitting as she often did. She didn't speak, but I saw her pause, glance up, and meet my eyes. Her expression wasn't shock or judgment. It was something quieter, something like sympathy, maybe even pride. She didn't say a word, but that look told me everything. I went to my room and packed what I could into one worn-out suitcase. A few clothes, my journal, a copy of my acceptance letter, and in a small envelope tucked carefully between pages, the pressed violet from Grandma Ruth's garden. I stood at the front door for a long moment, hand on the knob, waiting to hear someone call after me. But no one did. Jason had gone back to his peanuts, my mother disappeared into the kitchen, and my father poured himself another drink. When I stepped outside, the evening air was cool, and the crickets had just begun their nightly chorus. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. That was the night I left behind the life they had planned for me. A life of wine lists and oven schedules, of polite smiles and suffocating tradition. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just clear. Clearer than I'd ever been. I wasn't running away. I was planting myself somewhere I could finally grow. The first morning at Evergreen College was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The campus was blanketed in early fog, and Helen stepped off the shuttle with her suitcase dragging behind her, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and her acceptance letter crumpled in her pocket. Her heart pounded not with excitement, but with a steady hum of doubt. This was the beginning of her own life, the path no one in her family believed she could walk. And now, she had to prove mostly to herself that they were wrong. Her dorm room was small, and smelled faintly of old paint. The furniture was basic, the view uninspiring. She didn't have the luxury of decorating it the way other students did. No string lights, no posters. Just a small pressed violet tucked inside the cover of her old gardening journal and a second-hand desk lamp she bought at a flea market 2 days before moving in. Classes began quickly. The landscape design program was more intense than she expected. Terms like soil pH, hardscaping, and drainage infrastructure filled her notebooks. While most students came from architecture prep programs or art schools, Helen had arrived with nothing more than dirt under her fingernails and a stubborn desire to make things grow. To make ends meet, she took a job at a local garden center just off campus. It was modest rows of perennials in cracked plastic trays, the scent of mulch always lingering in the air, but she felt at ease among the plants. She spent early mornings stocking fertilizer and late evenings sweeping gravel aisles. It was exhausting, but familiar. In the quiet hours, when customers had gone and the mist settled low over the flowers, she found peace. Still, she kept to herself. While other students laughed loudly in the dining hall or formed late-night study groups, Helen sat alone. It wasn't that she disliked people. She simply didn't know how to make herself visible in a world where no one expected her to matter. That changed on a rainy Thursday during her second week of classes. Helen was seated in the back of Studio Design Fundamentals, flipping through her sketchpad, when someone plopped loudly into the seat beside her. "Ugh, I hate this weather. My hair turns into a chia pet when it rains," the girl announced. Helen looked up to see a redhead with wild curls, mismatched earrings, and the kind of smile that disarmed you instantly. "I'm Zoe," she said, extending a hand with green nail polish chipped at the edges. "You look like you know what you're doing. Mind if I copy off your existential despair?" Helen blinked. Then, without meaning to, she laughed. From that moment, Zoe was a constant. She was vibrant where Helen was quiet, spontaneous where Helen planned. But she never made Helen feel small. Quite the opposite, Zoe celebrated her. She dragged her to plant nurseries on weekends, introduced her to almond milk lattes, and pushed her to show her work in class critiques. "You've got a brain like a greenhouse," Zoe would say. "Everything grows in there if you just let it out." Then came Professor Clark. Tall, silver-haired, with a wardrobe that never strayed from gray vests and khaki trousers, Professor Clark was known as the toughest critic in the department. He didn't give compliments. He gave lectures and raised eyebrows. Helen admired him from afar, convinced he didn't know she existed. That changed during a midterm project when students were tasked with designing a pocket park for a fictional urban neighborhood. Helen stayed up for 3 nights straight, sketching and reshaping her layout, refining details. Her final model was inspired by Grandma Ruth's garden. Meandering paths, layered textures, bursts of lavender, and a single violet centerpiece at the entrance. She didn't tell anyone what it meant to her, she just let it speak for itself. On presentation day, Clark stood silently in front of her model for a long time. Then he said, "You see space the way most people read poetry." He didn't smile. He simply nodded once and walked away. That single sentence stayed with her longer than any grade. Recognition was unfamiliar, but something in her shifted that day. When she passed through the studio, other students now stopped to peek at her sketches. A few even asked for her thoughts on their layouts. Slowly, she found herself invited to study groups. Zoe bragged about her to anyone who would listen. For the first time, Helen wasn't the gardener in someone else's kitchen. She was a designer, an artist, someone whose vision mattered. One afternoon, as she locked up the garden center and watched the sun dip behind a row of trees, she thought of her father and Jason probably discussing wine pairings and pasta sauces. They hadn't called, hadn't written, but somehow, it didn't ache as much anymore. Because now, for the first time, she belonged somewhere. Not because she changed to fit the space, but because she finally found a space that fit her. It had been nearly 4 months since Helen left home, and in all that time no one from her family had reached out. No letters, no calls, just silence. But one October afternoon, as golden leaves danced across the stone paths of campus, she found herself staring at her phone, thumb hovering over her mother's number. She didn't know what she expected, a warm greeting, maybe a sliver of curiosity, just something that hinted at care. The phone rang 4 times before her mother answered. "Helen?" The voice on the other end was clipped, like she'd answered by accident. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to check in," Helen said, her voice unsure. "See how everyone's doing." A long pause followed. Then, cool as polished marble, her mother replied, "We're fine. Jason's been taking more shifts at the restaurant. Your father's been proud." Helen nodded, though no one could see it. "That's good. I've been doing okay too, busy with class projects. My professor said my last design had strong vision." Another pause. "You're still playing in the dirt, then?" The words hit like a slap, not violent, but deliberate. Helen's stomach dropped. "It's not just dirt, Mom," she said, more defensive than she meant to sound. "It's design, environmental planning. I'm learning how to—" "Well, just don't expect it to pay the bills." Her mother cut in, tone flat. "Anyway, I have to go. The delivery truck just pulled up." Click. Helen stared at the screen for a long time after the call ended. There was no warmth, no pride, not even a take care. It felt like she'd called a stranger. That night, a message from Jason lit up her phone. "So, has growing lettuce paid off yet? Let me know if you need a loan from someone with a real job." She didn't reply. She didn't cry. But something inside her curled in on itself. She hadn't expected applause, but the sting of mockery, especially from Jason, who had always found joy in her discomfort, hit harder than she liked to admit. It stirred old doubts, old fears that maybe, just maybe, her father had been right. That this dream of shaping gardens and public spaces was nothing more than a fantasy dressed in flowers. That weekend, under the weight of midterms and mounting bills, she sat in the corner of the design studio long after everyone else had left. Her sketchpad lay open, but her hand wouldn't move. The design in front of her, an urban green corridor proposal, looked like nonsense. She couldn't focus. Her brain was fog, her chest tight. For the first time since starting at Evergreen, she thought about quitting. She could go back, get a job at the restaurant, maybe even take some business classes like they wanted. Stop chasing this vision that no one seemed to believe in but her. The door creaked behind her. Zoe walked in, 2 coffees in hand. She set one down in front of Helen, sat beside her without a word, and waited. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this," Helen finally whispered. "They think I'm delusional." Zoe didn't try to sugarcoat it. "Well, maybe you are. I mean, most people who change the world are." Helen looked at her, uncertain. Zoe leaned in. Do you love it? Yes, Helen said, without hesitation. Then that's enough. The world doesn't need another restaurant manager who hates her life. It needs someone who can see beauty where others don't. That's you. Helen smiled, small and tired, but real. A few days later, Professor Clark pulled lay. After class. You've belay, he said plainly. Your lines lack confidence. Your colors are muted. What's going on? Helen hesitated, then answered truthfully. It's hard to keep believing in yourself when the people who raised you don't. Professor Clark studied her a moment. Then he said, That's your first real lesson. Don't wait for them. Don't wait for anyone. Recognition is nice, but it's fragile. You have to know your own worth first. Design from there. The words sank in deep. That night, Helen returned to her draft. She tore out the older sketches, rolled up her sleeves, and started again. She let the lines flow without fear, drew curves instead of boxes, textures instead of symmetry. She remembered Grandma Ruth's words that beauty wasn't perfect. It was layered. It was alive. By morning, her design was reborn. She wasn't doing this to impress her father, or to silence Jason. She was doing this for herself, for the child who pressed violets in books, for the young woman who left with a suitcase and a scholarship, for the future, where she didn't just survive, but created. Helen wasn't playing in the dirt. She was planting the future. The phone call came just after midnight. Helen had been up late working on a design draft, her desk lit only by a small lamp and the soft glow of the streetlights outside. She recognized the voice immediately, Aunt Carol, but it trembled in a way Helen had never heard before. It's Grandma Ruth, Carol said, barely above a whisper. She passed away in her sleep tonight. The world stopped moving. Helen clutched the edge of her desk as the words washed over her. There was no illness, no warning, just gone. Like the last petal of a flower falling silently to the ground. The next morning, Helen boarded a bus back to her hometown, her sketchpad untouched in her bag. The ride was quiet, filled with muted landscapes flashing past the windows. She stared out, barely blinking, her mind looping back to the last time she saw Grandma Ruth laughing gently, a pair of dirt-stained gloves in her hands, talking about planting tulips next spring. There would be no next spring now. When she arrived at the funeral home, the air felt thick with unspoken words. Her parents didn't greet her. Jason gave her a single nod, more of acknowledgement than welcome. The rest of the extended family looked at her the way people glance at strangers at a party they weren't invited to. Helen stood at the back during the service. No one offered her a seat. No one asked how she was doing. Aunt Carol gave her a small smile across the room, but even she didn't approach. It was as though her presence was a disruption, a reminder of something no one wanted to deal with. After the burial, everyone gathered at the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. Helen sat silently in the corner, hands folded in her lap. Her parents sat close to Jason, who wore a black suit and a smug certainty. He leaned back in his chair, confident in what he believed was rightfully his. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, almost tired tone, began the reading. There were a few token items, jewelry to distant cousins, a small donation to the church Ruth had attended for years. Then, the words changed. To my granddaughter, Helen Carter, the lawyer read, I leave my house, my garden, and all its contents. It was in that soil that she found herself. It was there that I saw her heart bloom. The room went still. Jason sat forward, blinking. What? That can't be right. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. It's clearly stated. Helen inherits the entire property. Jason scoffed and turned toward Helen. You've lived in a dorm room for the last year. You think you can take care of a whole house? A garden? You don't even live here anymore. Helen didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight to speak. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out the small envelope that had been handed to her privately just before the reading. A letter from Grandma Ruth, with her name written in the familiar slanted handwriting. She hadn't opened it yet. Jason leaned back, fuming. This is ridiculous. That property could be sold and split, Why should she get everything? Their father grumbled something about fairness under his breath. Their mother crossed her arms, offering no opinion, just a stiff silence. But the lawyer's voice remained steady. The will is valid. Mrs. Ruth Carter's wishes were made in full capacity and witnessed accordingly. Helen sat motionless, the envelope clutched in both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she held on tight, as if letting go would shatter the last piece she had of her grandmother. In that moment, she didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She felt alone. But beneath the grief, beneath the heavy silence, something else flickered resolve. Her grandmother had believed in her, even when her own parents hadn't, even when her brother had laughed in her face, even when no one else in that room could see it. Ruth had seen. Helen didn't say a word. She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend her right to the inheritance. She simply stood, nodded respectfully to the lawyer, and walked out into the fading afternoon light with the envelope still sealed. The house wasn't just a house. It was memory. It was roots. It was home. And now, it was hers. The old house creaked when Helen stepped through the door. The air inside still smelled faintly of lavender and earth, just as it had every summer she visited Grandma Ruth. Dust danced in the late afternoon sun, slicing through the lace curtains. Everything had been left, just as Ruth had lived, neatly folded quilts on the couch, ceramic birds perched on the windowsills, gardening boots lined by the back door. Helen set her suitcase down and stood still for a moment, unsure if she should cry or smile. This wasn't just a house now. It was an inheritance, a responsibility, and perhaps, if she was brave enough, the beginning of something greater. She spent the first few days in silence. No classes, no texts, no noise. Just pruning overgrown vines, pulling weeds from flower beds, and replanting herbs in the same wooden boxes her grandmother used for decades. At first, it felt like tending a grave, an act of mourning disguised as productivity. But as the soil warmed beneath her hands, Helen began to feel something else stir inside her. This wasn't just about memory. It was about creation, continuation, growth. Word of her return spread slowly through the town, mostly through whispers and sideways glances at the grocery store. But Helen didn't mind. She kept her focus on the garden, waking before sunrise to dig, plant, and design. Her journal filled with sketches, patterns of native plants, layouts for walking paths, ideas for shade structures. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what felt right. Then, one morning, while sipping coffee on the back steps, Helen noticed a flyer tucked into her mailbox. It was an announcement for the city's upcoming community revitalization project. The town was accepting proposals for a new public park to be built on a neglected lot near the elementary school. The deadline was 4 weeks away. She stared at the paper for a long time. It would be easier not to try. Easier to stay in the garden, quiet and unseen. But something in her resisted the idea of hiding. She thought of her grandmother's hands, rough, strong, never afraid of hard work. She thought of her own now, dirt-stained and calloused, no longer unsure. That afternoon, Helen began drafting. For 3 weeks, she poured every ounce of herself into the design. She combined the structure she learned in school with the soul she inherited from Ruth. Every curve of the walking path, every placement of a bench or tree, was intentional. She even included a memorial wildflower patch, a nod to local history and quiet reflection. When the submission was complete, she turned it in without fanfare. No one knew. Not Zoe, not Professor Clark, certainly not her family. It was out of her hands now. Weeks passed. Helen resumed her work in the garden, though this time with a strange new feeling hovering nearby possibility. Then the call came. She had won. The city loved her vision. They called it intimate, intuitive, and deeply human. The project would be funded, built by spring, and open to the public with a formal dedication. And this stunned her most. It would carry her name. The Helen Carter Community Park. Helen sat in the old kitchen chair her grandmother once knitted in and stared out the window. Not in disbelief, but in quiet pride. The opening ceremony came on a crisp April morning. She arrived early, watching volunteers arrange flowers and polish the new signage. That's when a silver-haired man approached her, his expression warm. "You're Helen Carter, aren't you?" he asked. "I am. I'm Roger Fielding, one of the judges. I don't expect you remember, but we met a long time ago. Your brother turned down a business partnership I pitched to the family restaurant. Polite on the surface, but it was clear I wasn't welcome." Helen nodded slowly. Roger smiled. "But you helped me carry boxes to my car that day. You asked me questions about my work. You listened. I never forgot that." Helen's voice caught in her throat. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "Well," Roger said, motioning to the park, "now everyone will know." She didn't invite her family to the opening. She didn't send them the article from the paper or post about the ceremony. Instead, that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees she had chosen, Helen snapped a photo of the park's new entrance, sign her name in bronze lettering beneath the city seal. She sent it to one person only, Aunt Carol. No caption, no explanation. Just proof. Proof that she had built something from the ground they once dismissed. That she had turned silence into beauty. That she hadn't just survived their rejection, she had grown beyond it. Rooted, resilient, and finally seen. Helen had started to gain steady clients since the park project launched. Word spread quietly, like roots beneath the surface, weaving their way through the local design scene. She had no flashy website, no aggressive social media presence. Just referrals, reputation, and results. That was enough. One afternoon, her inbox chimed with a proposal from a well-regarded design firm in the city. The message was brief. A restaurant project needed a landscape concept for its new outdoor dining space. Budget approved, timeline tight, vision. Modern rustic elegance, soft edges, inviting, local flora. It was the kind of brief Helen loved. Anonymous, all business. She accepted. For the next 2 weeks, she threw herself into the work. She toured the site, sketched out paths and partitions, chose native stone and drought-tolerant plants that would thrive without constant maintenance. She added unexpected touches, a small herb wall near the kitchen entrance, creeping jasmine woven into steel trellises to soften the modern facade. It was beautiful, balanced. She sent in the final designs, coordinated the build with the contractor, and moved on to her next job. She never met the restaurant owners directly. She preferred it that way. Weeks passed. Then, one Saturday afternoon, she received an invitation to a soft opening. It was a formality sent through the agency handling the design contract. Clients often invited designers to show off the final result. Normally, Helen declined these events. But something nudged her that day, a quiet urge to see her work in its finished form. She arrived early. The parking lot was full of sleek cars, and the entrance buzzed with small talk and champagne flutes. As she stepped through the iron gate and onto the flagstone path she had drawn by hand, her breath caught for a moment. The space was just as she imagined, soft light filtering through the canopy trees, the scent of rosemary wafting from the planter boxes, the sound of water trickling from the stone basin near the host stand. It was one of her finest projects. She wandered toward the far edge of the patio, content to stay out of the way, when a familiar voice floated over the hum of conversation. "Now this is what I'm talking about," Jason said, standing near the bar with a glass of wine in hand. "The design is clean, simple, but there's character. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Helen froze. She hadn't recognized the project address during her site visits. It had still been under renovation. No signs, no branding. But now, standing here, it was unmistakable. This was Jason's new venture. She watched as he glanced around the garden, a look of pride softening his usually hard-set jaw. Beside him, Melissa, in a pearl-studded blazer and sunglasses despite the shade, rolled her eyes. Probably some online freelancer from Instagram. You know how trendy these garden aesthetics are now. She sipped her drink and shrugged. Cute, though. Helen's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She didn't step forward, didn't speak up. She let the moment pass like a breeze across the garden beds. It wasn't her name etched into the signage this time. But her hands were in every stone, every plant, every corner of that space. And they loved it. She lingered for a while, just long enough to see guests snapping photos, couples commenting on the peaceful atmosphere, a little girl tracing her finger along the mosaic tile she'd chosen for the fountain wall. Then, without a word, she slipped out through the same gate she had designed to blend seamlessly into the hedgerow. No one noticed her leave. As she drove home, a quiet satisfaction settled over her, not revenge, not vindication, but something more powerful. Presence. She was there. Her work was there. It spoke without needing her voice. She didn't need to be seen to be known. And even if her family never learned the truth, they had, for once, praised her without mockery, without dismissal. They had applauded her. They just didn't know it. The envelope arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning, tucked between a stack of utility bills and a gardening catalog. Helen had nearly tossed it aside, assuming it was another promotional flyer, until she noticed the paper thick, cream-colored, with embossed gold edging. No return address. Just her name, printed neatly in calligraphy. Curious. She slid her finger under the flap and pulled out the contents. Her eyes scanned the first line, and she froze. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Jason Carter and Melissa Greer. Her pulse quickened. There was no note, no sender, no apology or explanation, just a formal invitation and an RSVP card. She set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, her coffee going cold beside her. For a moment, she thought it might be a mistake, maybe someone sent it out of obligation. Or worse, as a joke. Her brother hadn't spoken to her since the will reading. Melissa had never acknowledged her outside of a thinly veiled insult. Why now? That afternoon, Helen called Zoe. They invited you? Zoe's voice crackled through the speaker. Seriously? After everything? Helen didn't answer right away. I mean, don't you think this is some setup? Zoe continued. You've been doing great. They ignored you for years, mocked you, and now suddenly, hey sis, come watch us toast to our perfect life. Please. I don't know what it is, Helen said quietly, but it's not going to shake me. So, you're not going? Helen looked at the invitation again. The names, the location, her family's new restaurant, of course, and the date. Just 2 weeks away. I haven't decided. That night, she sat at her desk, flipping through an old sketchbook. Between the ink designs and sun-faded watercolors, she found it. The dried violet from her grandmother's garden, still pressed between 2 pages. Its edges were delicate, but its color had endured. She ran her thumb gently over the brittle petals. Her mind drifted to the last conversation she had with Grandma Ruth in that very house. Sometimes, standing tall in a room full of people who doubted you is the quietest kind of triumph. She placed the violet in a new notebook, clean pages, waiting for the next story, and closed it softly. The following day, she drove into the city. Not for work, for a dress. She didn't want something loud. This wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about presence. She found a dress in a muted shade of deep forest green, simple, elegant, nothing flashy. When she tried it on, she saw a woman looking back in the mirror. Not the girl who used to shrink in family dinners, or the college student with dirt under her nails. This was someone who had built her name from soil and silence. She bought matching shoes, low-heeled and practical. A silver pendant, no makeup artist, no new hairdo, just Helen, refined in her own skin. 2 days before the wedding, she received a text from Aunt Carol. I heard you got the invitation. I won't tell you what to do, but if you show up, stand proud. They've never seen you as you are now. Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to. The decision had already taken root. On the morning of the wedding, she woke early, drank her tea by the window, and packed her bag. Dress laid out. Shoes shined. She tucked the violet gently into a small keepsake locket and pinned it just inside her clutch. A quiet reminder that she didn't walk into that room alone. She walked with history, with memory, with Ruth. As she stepped out the door, locking it behind her, she didn't feel fear. She felt ready. The valet took her keys with a polite nod, but Helen could already feel the weight of familiar eyes on her as she stepped onto the stone path. The restaurant gleamed under golden lights, its facade polished and modern, nothing like the worn wooden building it had once been. Jason had spared no expense for the occasion. The air buzzed with soft jazz and clinking glasses, the laughter of guests echoing like a soundtrack of a life she'd never been allowed to belong to. She walked in with quiet grace, her deep green dress brushing the floor just so, her hair pinned neatly, her back straight. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here to beg for attention. But she was here. At the host's table, she gave her name. The woman behind the stand frowned slightly and shuffled the seating list. "Carter. Helen Carter?" she asked again, scanning the paper. "Yes." After another pause, the woman gave a tight smile. "Of course, we have a spot for you." She was led around the edges of the grand dining room, past tables adorned with white roses and tall gold candlesticks, until they reached a small two-seat table wedged near the hallway to the restrooms. The sound of the bathroom door opening and closing punctuated the classical music. There was no place card with her name. Helen sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. She looked across the room. Jason sat at the center table, all charm and confidence in his tuxedo. Melissa stood beside him, draped in white satin, her fingers glittering with more diamonds than taste. The couple posed as guests approached, smiling for photos beneath a floral arch Helen herself had designed, though they didn't know it. Moments later, Melissa approached her table, flanked by a pair of bridesmaids who whispered into their champagne glasses. "Oh, you made it," Melissa said, feigning surprise. "I wasn't sure if your little plants would let you off for the weekend." Helen said nothing. Melissa's eyes dropped to Helen's plate. "You did wash your hands before touching the bread rolls, right? I mean, dirt gets everywhere." One of the bridesmaids stifled a laugh. Helen remained silent, her expression unreadable. Jason appeared next, sipping wine and strolling like a man who believed every inch of this venue belonged to him. He stopped beside her, gaze smug. "Didn't think you'd show. Thought you'd be elbow-deep in compost today." Helen looked up at him, calm and still. His voice no longer held the power it once had. He didn't know that. Before she could speak, a hand gently rested on her shoulder. Aunt Carol. She wore a simple navy dress and a quiet strength in her eyes. She didn't look at Jason or Melissa. She just leaned in and whispered, "Don't say a word. Just sit tall. They'll figure it out soon enough." Helen met her gaze and nodded once. As Carol walked away, Helen caught a strange look from one of the guests across the room. The woman tilted her head slightly, squinting as if trying to place her. Another guest at the next table whispered something, then looked back at Helen with widened eyes. It started like a breeze through tall grass, subtle, almost invisible, but it moved. A man near the front, older and dressed in a gray suit, nudged his companion and pointed. "Is that the woman who did the city park?" he murmured. The name was passed from table to table, like an old story rediscovered. The Helen Carter, the designer behind the park, the woman in the news last spring, the one with the award. She hadn't announced herself. She hadn't entered with fanfare or demanded attention. But the room was starting to shift, and Jason and Melissa hadn't noticed. Not yet. The music softened as dessert plates were cleared and wine glasses refilled. Guests turned their attention toward the small stage in the center of the room, where a podium had been set up for the evening's toasts and acknowledgments. The chatter slowed, replaced by polite anticipation. A man in a gray tailored suit approached the microphone. Mayor Watkins, a well-respected figure in the region, and, as Helen recalled, a distant cousin of Melissa's family. He tapped the mic gently, clearing his throat. "Good evening, everyone," he began with a warm smile. "What a joy it is to gather here tonight for such a beautiful celebration. Jason and Melissa, you've built something special, and we're all lucky to be part of it." Scattered applause followed. "But before we raise our glasses to this fine couple, I'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge someone else in the room. A person who, without seeking attention, has made a profound impact on our city." A ripple of interest passed through the guests. Helen sat completely still. As many of you know, the city recently unveiled a new community park, a project that transformed an abandoned, overgrown lot into one of the most beautiful public spaces we've had in decades. Green, accessible, sustainable. It's not just a park, it's a symbol of renewal. Jason, who had been mid-sip, paused. Melissa looked toward the podium, confused. This project was the vision of someone whose talent and dedication have quietly changed our landscape literally. Someone whose work has brought peace, beauty, and pride to our neighborhoods. The mayor smiled. I'm proud to say that this designer is right here in the room tonight. Please join me in honoring the brilliant landscape artist behind Carter Park, Miss Helen Carter. There was a pause, just a breath, and then the room erupted. Applause broke out across the hall. Guests stood, clapping, some even turning in their seats to get a glimpse of her. Whispers of her name spread like fire. At her table near the restroom, Helen felt the air change, felt the weight she'd carried for years begin to lift. Across the room, Jason's mouth hung open slightly. Melissa blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. Diane, sitting beside them, looked pale, clutching her wine glass so tightly her knuckles whitened. Helen rose from her seat with calm precision. She walked slowly toward the podium, the applause not dying down but rising, carrying her like a tide. She passed Jason's table without a glance, though she could feel their eyes on her burning with disbelief. When she reached the microphone, Mayor Watkins stepped back, offering the floor with a proud nod. Helen looked out over the crowd. So many of these faces had once dismissed her, laughed at her, or ignored her altogether. But now they saw her. And more importantly, she saw herself. Thank you, Mayor Watkins, she said, her voice steady and clear. And thank you all for this incredible acknowledgement. She paused, letting the room fall into a respectful hush. When I started this journey, most people saw what I did as just playing in the dirt. I wasn't invited to join the table. I wasn't even asked what I wanted from my life. But I've learned that sometimes, you don't need anyone's permission to bloom. You just need to plant yourself where the light can reach. A few heads nodded. Aunt Carol, from the back, smiled quietly. I'm grateful, Helen continued. To those who saw value where others saw nothing. To those who believed without needing proof. And most of all, to the silence. Because it gave me space to grow. She stepped back, nodded once, and turned away, not looking at her family, not waiting for their reaction. She walked down the steps to the sound of hands clapping and voices calling her name, not with sarcasm this time, but with admiration. And for the first time in her life, Helen Carter didn't feel like an outsider crashing someone else's celebration. She felt like the main event. The knock came 3 days after the wedding. Helen had just finished watering the lavender near the back gate when she heard it soft, hesitant, like someone unsure they had the right to be there. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the front door. Jason stood on the porch, shoulders slightly hunched, wearing a suit that looked like it hadn't been pressed since the reception. His tie was gone, and the usual cockiness in his eyes had been replaced with something closer to desperation. Can I come in? He asked, voice low. Helen didn't move. Say what you came to say. Jason shifted awkwardly. The restaurant things are tight. Overhead's killing us, the investor pulled out. I was thinking, maybe we could partner up. You've got momentum now. Your name, your work. Helen raised an eyebrow. I mean, it's just business, he added quickly. You've got the recognition, and I've got the kitchen. We could turn this around. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, she stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind her. I'm not investing in a place that once treated me like baggage, she said, her tone even. You didn't see my worth when I was sweeping leaves. You don't get to cash in now. Jason's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He looked away. It wasn't personal. It always was. She didn't say it with anger, just truth. And that truth didn't need to be argued. Jason gave a short, awkward nod and walked down the steps. He didn't say goodbye. That evening, as the sun dipped low across the horizon, Aunt Carol arrived holding a small envelope, yellowed with age. I found this tucked inside one of your grandma's gardening books, she said gently. It had your name on it. Helen took it with quiet hands. Inside was a single page, written in Ruth's delicate script. My dear Helen, some people will never believe in flowers. They'll walk right past them without a glance. They'll call them useless, frivolous. But that doesn't stop a flower from blooming. Not every root needs an audience. Some grow stronger when they grow alone. And when they bloom, oh, how the world changes quietly, beautifully. Never forget, your hands were made to grow beauty, even when no one is watching. Love, Grandma Ruth. Helen held the letter to her chest, eyes misting not with sorrow, but with something softer. Gratitude, grace. She walked into the garden and sat on the stone bench she had built herself, just beneath the trellis draped in morning glory. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary and thyme. The same soil her grandmother had once dug with her bare hands was now alive with color, fragrance, and life. From the little box in her lap, she removed the dried violet. Its color had faded some, but the form was still perfect. Carefully, she placed it into a small vase near the sundial and adjusted the petals gently. She didn't look back toward the house. She didn't think of Jason, or Diane, or Melissa. She didn't need to. The garden didn't need their validation. And neither did she. She had grown, not in spite of them, but beyond them. And in that quiet, blooming moment, Helen Carter, landscape designer, granddaughter, woman, was finally, fully free. Helen didn't seek revenge through anger. She sought it by living a life they never imagined she could. She didn't need her parents' approval. She didn't need an apology from Jason. She didn't need explanations or validation from anyone. She walked through mockery, endured dismissal, and proved that sometimes the things most underestimated carry the quietest strength. A gardener doesn't need fireworks to bloom, only soil, light, and time. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I hope this story gave you something. A sense of recognition, a flicker of hope, or even just a breath of relief, knowing that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been the gardener in your own life story? Have you ever had your dreams dismissed by those closest to you? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have more true, powerful stories waiting to be told, stories to remind you that the path less taken might be harder, but it leads to the most breathtaking blooms.